Ham radio bands. No, I'm not talking about music. I'm talking about the ham radio amateur bands, the bands that we transmit on. How much are they at risk? Are they vulnerable? And that age-old phrase, use or lose. Let's take a look. Hello and welcome once again to the Waters and Stanton ham radio video channel. My name is Peter Waters and my ham radio call sign is Golf 3 Oscar Juliet Victor. You know, some 60 years ago there was a ham radio operator, Roy Stevens, G2BVN. He was a very active member of the local ham radio club that I belonged to in Romford in Essex. He was ex-RAF and he became a president of the RSGB in the early 60s. And he came up with the phrase, not an original phrase I'm sure, but he came up with a phrase which was designed to promote discussion, and that was the ham radio bands use or lose. Now, that was 60 odd years ago. I'm not quite sure what the ham radio population was then. We certainly didn't have so many ham radio bands, but it was a question that needed to be asked and needed to be dealt with. But it's also one of these questions which there is no real answer. Everybody's got their own views, but I think the idea was to promote discussion. And I think probably things haven't changed that much today. We've got probably more ham radio operators than we had then. We've certainly got more bands than we had then. And the expanse of band usage has increased in terms of the fact that we've got 160 metres and then we can go up into the gigahertz bands. And all these bands are occupied. But are they occupied enough to justify that we have them? And are they at risk? Now, I don't pretend to have the answer to this, but I think it's a discussion point that is worth bringing up at clubs. And I'm sure the RSGB will be looking at this, or constantly looking at this, because there is always the risk that the radio bands, or part of the radio bands, could be taken away from us. And why would that be? Well, I suppose that if a non-amateur technician was to look at the ham radio bands and monitor them, he would think, wow, all this space, and there's nobody using them. Well, that's not quite true. So let's take a look. I think, generally speaking, the view would be that the HF bands are not at any great risk, because all the professional operators, all the commercial operators use bands much higher than this. Well, I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that everybody knows how much the HF bands are used commercially. Certainly they are used for military purposes, but to how much, I don't know. But it's one of these things that we should actually not take for granted, that the HF bands that we've got, the HF band allocation we've got, are ours. There could be a point in time, either now or in the future, when HF bands become prime territory that the commercial users want to perhaps reclaim from the ham operators. Why would this be? Well, I can't look into a crystal ball and I don't have the answer, but one of the things that strikes me is that the HF bands are one of these areas of the radio spectrum which provide long distance communication and don't depend on anything other than nature. In other words, we are not dependent on satellites. Now, satellites, of course, are at risk. They could fail, they could be shot down. The great thing about the HF spectrum is it provides long distance communication and it uses natural resources. Now, I suppose you could argue that global warming may have an effect. I don't know. I don't have that information. But it is a fact that the HF bands are one of the most amazing parts of the radio spectrum, because it provides long-distance communication. I'm sure that when Marconi first started his experiments, he didn't know about the F layers and the E layers, and the fact that these shortwave bands could actually provide long-distance communication. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying that the early amateurs started to lose a bit of the spectrum, because it was suddenly realised that these shortwave bands that they shoved the amateurs on in the 1920s and 1930s, because they couldn't cause much of a problem there, nobody used the shortwave bands, so they suddenly realised that the shortwave bands were a very valuable commodity. They could provide long distance communication, and of course that hasn't changed. There will always be a case for using the HF bands for long distance communication, because they provide this medium without any mechanical intervention. In other words, there's no satellites used. The downside, of course, is that nature is never stable, and we know that the HF bands provide long distance communication on some days and not on others, but you can't ignore the fact that they do that completely free of charge, completely dependent on nature. It's an amazing thing that you can transmit a signal at one point and it can be received several thousand miles away simply because of nature. No intervention, no satellites needed at all. So long distance communication on the HF bands is certainly a great attraction, and I'm sure that there are commercial users that would still want to use this, whether it be, when I say commercial, I'm talking, it could be government, it could be military, etc., etc. So we do need to be aware that these bands are not necessarily ours forevermore. They could be vulnerable. Now, when it comes to the VHF and UHF bands, I suppose these areas must be even more vulnerable. And I have to say that if, again, this technician was to tune around the bands, the amateur bands, on 2 meters, 4 meters, 70 sems, etc., they would wonder, are these bands actually used? You know, I try to operate on the activity nights that the RSGB organise, and when you operate on one of these activity nights on 2 metres, 70 sems, 4 metres, etc., they're full of signals. But there is a lot of the time when they're not full of signals. Great big open spaces. Spaces that the commercial users might think, wait a minute, we're looking for space, and there it is. Now, of course, a lot of the operation that we do these days doesn't require a lot of spectrum space. Whisper FT8 operates on very narrow bands. We've got lots of repeaters dotted around, but how many of those are actually used on a daily basis? With the number of repeaters that are, if you look at the repeater map, the RSGB repeater map, you would think the bands would be full of signals, but in fact they're not. A lot of these repeaters are used only very occasionally, and again, to this technician who tunes around the bands, he would think, wait a minute, where is all this activity? Then, of course, we've got some ham operators who operate on computer networks. In fact, there's no or very little radio involved, and they are invisible. In fact, I did a video about that recently, the invisible hams. So we've got lots of ham operation which is not really visible. FT8 is a very narrow band. Satellite operation is great, but there are many times when there is no satellite operation because the satellites are out of range. So for anybody listening to the ham radio bands, there is a lot of the time when they are not used, and that does make it vulnerable. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is sort of a question, a discussion area, of which there is no obvious answer. Each individual ham operator has got his own pet likes and dislikes, and he operates on certain bands, and maybe the band conditions are not that good and therefore he won't operate on them. And I suppose we can justify why 10 metres is closed a lot of the time and 15 metres and 12 metres, because there is no propagation there. But there are other bands where possibly they are vulnerable to the likes of commercial or military use, and we mustn't be blind to that. So is there an answer? Well, I don't pretend to know the answer. Certainly a lot of the recent developments, when I say recent, the last 20 or 30 years in ham radio, has actually focused operation on narrow segments. A repeater, for example, will attract a lot of the local guys to operate on the repeater or listen on the repeater, so it takes away the point-to-point simplex contacts. And then you've got data modes, where a lot of the data modes operate on quite narrow parts of the spectrum. I mean, FT8, which is a more recent mode, is a prime example of that. Very narrow part of the spectrum occupied by a lot of stations, working quite amazing distances, but it only needs a small amount of the spectrum. The bits either side are very often not occupied at all. So we have lots of open spaces on the ham radio bands where I suppose the casual listener would say, wait a minute, these areas aren't really used that much. I've monitored it for several days and heard nothing. So do the amateurs really need these spaces? Well, of course, we can always put up a good argument for use of the bands, but putting up an argument is not quite the same as providing practical demonstrations that the bands are occupied. In other words, if we only use a part of a band or a segment occasionally, how can we argue our case when a band is not occupied very much at all? It's very difficult, of course. And I think that we need to give it serious consideration. Now, I don't have an answer, unfortunately, and I'm not sure anybody's got an answer to this. I'm sure there will be a lot of views, but I think we must be aware that the bands are vulnerable. And I guess one of the reasons is that there's not so many CQs put out these days. There's a lot of listening goes on. I'm sure there is a lot of listening goes on, and I'm as guilty as anybody else. I tune across the 2 metre SSB band and I hear no signals. Do I put out a CQ? Probably not very often, because there's nobody on the band. Now, how ridiculous is that? I'm tuning across a band, I can't hear any signals, so I don't put out a CQ. That's a crazy situation. So I suppose that one of the ways in which we can improve matters is to put out a CQ when the band is quiet. I mean, there's no point in putting out a CQ if 10 metres is closed, then probably you're not going to get any contacts. But if we take, for example, let's take 2 metres, which is one of our most popular bands, and yet for time and time again I listen on it, there's very, very few signals. That band is always open in as much as it's available for short point-to-point contacts. When I say short, it could be 50, 100 miles. Now, if you listen on it and you don't hear any signals, do you put out a CQ, or do you think, oh, there's no signals, so I'll go on to another band? That's the sort of frame of mind that a lot of us are in, and as I say, I am as guilty as anybody for that. So I think next time you have a club meeting, discuss it, because it is something we want to be mindful of. You know, these days, once you lose something, it's very difficult to get back. I mean, I think if we were to lose part of 2 metres or part of 70 SEMS, it would be an almost impossible task ever to get it back. So, as Roy Stevens said many years ago, use or lose. It was appropriate then, and I think it's just as appropriate now. Well, I hope this hasn't sounded too depressing. It wasn't intended to be. The reason for it really is there's a number of conversations I've had recently where the topic has come up, and I thought, well, if it is on people's minds that I've spoken to, it must be on other people's minds. And it's probably the sort of topic you can talk about at the local club. And probably, rather like me, you won't actually come up with any conclusive answers. I mean, there's not one single answer, but it is something that we should be mindful about. And that really is why I've done this video. The next videos will be, I was going to say a bit more interesting, well, they'll be about products and so forth and techniques. So thank you for watching this, if in fact you've stayed to the end of it. And the next product, well, no, I'm not going to tell you what the next product is or the next couple of products, but I think you'll find them interesting. In the meantime, enjoy your ham radio, take care, and we'll speak soon.